Gideon and Prince Appiah, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here, and really appreciate the time that people have put into to watch this as well. Let me just share my screen. Let's see if so. Oops. Okay, can you see that?
Yes.
Great. Thank you, Prince Appiah. Okay. Firstly, a few words about the Deep Sea Conservation Coalition. We are a coalition of non-governmental organizations concerned with the protection of the deep sea, among our members. What we're talking about here, and Gideon gave us a good idea of the concerns that we have. The deep sea comprises 90% of the marine environment, and again, the similar amount of the planet that can support animal life. It's home to the greatest diversity of species and ecosystems on Earth. And what we're talking about in deep sea mining in particular is mining polymetallic nodules, which are like potato shaped small nodules, metallic nodules that lay at the bottom of the ocean that have taken millions of years to form, and they themselves are host to life forms. The ocean itself has absorbed over 25% of all carbon released by humans, and over 90% of the heat introduced by humans, the anthropogenic heat. And of course, the ocean has enormous economic as well as cultural value to us all in providing for fisheries and livelihoods, and through marine genetic resources, things pharmaceutical, nutraceutical, and other products. And of course, it's not only where we came from as a species, it's a cornerstone of our collective existence and our common heritage, but it is highly vulnerable and fragile. And we are only beginning to understand the importance of the ocean and the deep sea in climate change, including in the carbon sequestration and storage. We are becoming aware of the issue of biodiversity, the need to prevent, halt, and reverse the degradation of ecosystems worldwide. And some recent announcements on this include the Leaders' Pledge for Nature, the Stockholm planetary boundaries, where we're exceeding a lot of the planetary boundaries already, leading to an awareness of the need for a holistic, a transformational economy and a circular economy. And most recently, just last week, the G7 announced a communique where it included the language I have in bold here, which says that the G7 is fully aware of the potentially devastating impacts on marine ecosystems and the functioning of the ocean as a climate regulator. And they go on to say, in order to safeguard the integrity, connectivity, and functioning of the deep sea ecosystems, we will continue to actively engage in the development of regulations for exploitation under the International Seabed Authority. Now, that statement contains, in my view, two really important and currently significant statements. Firstly, that the whole G7 is aware of the potentially devastating impacts on marine ecosystems and the functioning of a climate regulator. We need to stop and say, wow, this is an enormous admission by the G7. They then go on to say that we will continue to actively engage in the development of regulations. Now, at first sight, that looks as though they're going to continue to want to develop regulations. And we believe, and for reasons I will explain as the webinar goes on, that is an extremely bad idea. And putting it really, really simply, regulations for exploitation, once they are adopted, means deep sea mining will start. Make no mistakes. And that is why it's absolutely crucial that regulations are not put into place by the International Seabed Authority. But to say they will continue to actively engage in the development of regulations is, I think, a nuance, a different matter. And we certainly encourage active engagement in the debate about the deep sea mining and what to do about it. And the Deep Sea Conservation Coalition has been actively pushing for a moratorium on seabed mining for many years. And now, again, for reasons I'm going to explain, it has become absolutely crucial. A few comments on biodiversity loss. Scientists have said it will be unavoidable. That the metals company, which was the company pressing for the start of seabed mining in 2024, actually told the US Security Exchange Commission that given the significant volume of deep water and the difficulty of sampling or retrieving biological specimens in the area, a complete biological inventory may never be established. Accordingly, impacts on Clarion-Clipperton zone biodiversity may never be completely and definitively known. Again, this is an enormous statement coming from the company that wants to engage in seabed mining. And some of the impacts include not only destruction of the seabed, we know that there will be 100-ton, effectively bulldozers, they like to call them collectors or harvesters, but they really are more like bulldozers or dredgers, removing the bottom at least 10-15 centimeters of the seafloor and everything that lives there, creating not only sediment plumes on the seafloor, which no one knows how far they'll go and how long they will take to disperse. But in doing so, they will be taking up sediment through what are called risers, big, huge pipes, all the way 3,000 or 4,000 meters to the surface, where they'll be processed. The sediment will be processed by the surface ship. And then what they don't want, which would be the vast majority of what they've just brought up to the surface, will then be released from the pipes about 1,200 meters into the middle of the ocean. So that's well above the seabed. It's literally 2,000 or 3,000 meters above the seabed. And this will be a continuous plume of sediment, including toxic waste, including metals, which have been released into the environment. We know that particles will be suspended for over a year in the ocean and will travel well over 1,400 kilometers. This is by an MIT study that was released. It's only based on modeling. It could be a lot worse than that. But we do know from other papers, and I cite the papers and I give the references at the end, that this will be potentially a toxic waste, a toxic plume, and the impact of having a plume we know impacts suspension feeders, animals that feed in that area, that will impact microbial communities, and ultimately could affect the tuna populations as well as climate change mitigation by interfering with the processes in the ocean. A very prominent deep sea scientist, Dr. Deva Arman, has said, "We cannot protect what we don't know, manage what we do not understand, or sustainably steward what we do not value. If we continue blindly and irresponsibly with business as usual, we could cause irreparable damage and lose parts of the ocean before we truly know them." So this really is a crucial issue. But I just want to move on, but noting that again, when the metals company went public back in 2021, just last year, not only did they say what I said about the uncertainty on impacting biodiversity, but they also said that it is unknown whether the impact of nodule collection on global biodiversity will be less significant than those observed and measured with respect to land-based mining. Now, again, you've got to sit up, because one of the key arguments this company has been making over the years, that we should be collecting these metals through seabed mining because it will have less impact on biodiversity than land-based mining. Yet, in their statement made to the regulators in the US, where they have to be honest by law, they say, hey, we don't know whether the impacts on global biodiversity will be less significant than on land-based mining. So again, this is something from their own mouths. And this is important because, as I hinted at the beginning, a circular economy, we know, can reduce the demand for virgin metals. That already new battery technologies are entering the market that will not need deep sea minerals, particularly cobalt. And this is important because, and I'll get into this very shortly, the argument is made that we need these minerals for renewables revolution. That is simply not true. It is not true. You cannot state there are not enough minerals, both on land-based sources and in circulation, to provide the minerals we need for a renewables revolution. All they're saying is that we think it's better to mine the deep sea than to engage in terrestrial mining. But as I said, firstly, they've said, well, actually, we don't know. And secondly, we must remember seabed mining will not replace terrestrial mining. Let's be real. Once seabed mining starts, it will be a massive new industrial activity on the bottom of the ocean, and we will have terrestrial mining going on at the same time as seabed mining, and that's just reality. I mentioned about the alternative realities. For example, one of China's biggest electric vehicle manufacturers uses lithium iron phosphate battery that contains no nickel and no cobalt. And we all know we cannot say what the technology will look like in 2 years, 5 years, 10 years time. Yet we hear the seabed miners saying, oh, well, we can project out, we're going to need this amount of metals for motor vehicles and for electric cars in 2048. Anyone who says what the world is going to look like in 2048, let's face it, is just lying. Nobody knows that. And what we do know is that, again, closed loop use of metals using reuse and cycling can create a stronger economy, an economy more resistant to material shortages and price fluctuations and less dependent on the need for virgin minerals. And the United Nations have said in numerous reports that we need a more strategic global approach to mineral resource production, extraction, use, and reuse. We know that we cannot continue with business as usual and the old extractivist mentality. The Deep Sea Conservation Coalition has been talking to companies that could be potential users of deep sea minerals, and a number of companies, and some of the names that here up on the screen, have committed not to use these minerals in their supply chains, and have also noted that some very significant European fisheries organizations are committed to a moratorium because they are concerned about fisheries, the impact on fisheries could be from deep sea minerals or deep sea mining. Turning to the international commitments, we all know that Sustainable Development Goal 14 requires us to conserve and sustainably use the ocean, seas, and marine resources for sustainable development, including Target 14.2, to sustainably manage and protect marine and coastal ecosystems to avoid significant adverse impacts, including by strengthening the resilience and taking action for their restoration in order to achieve healthy and productive oceans. Well, I'm sorry, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to realize that deep sea mining will not conserve and sustainably use the oceans. It will introduce major destruction of biodiversity and pollution, and we know that. But also importantly, is Sustainable Development 12, which is to ensure sustainable consumption and production patterns. And that's just as important because, again, unsustainable consumption and production patterns lead to climate change, lead to the biodiversity crisis, lead to extinctions. So we need to remember SDG 12 when we talk about the SDGs. A few words on the international legal environment, and this is taking place under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS, and following UNCLOS in 1994, there was what's called an implementing agreement introduced that changed the voting. Quite frankly, took away a lot of the voting powers by the developing world, and it also introduced a 2-year rule, which I'm going to talk about shortly, and it changed the balance of voting in the International Seabed Authority. And it was passed because a lot of the developed countries did not like the deal that was struck in 1982. What I'd like to emphasize about the Law of the Sea Convention is that it was negotiated in the 1970s. In those days, we were only just beginning to understand even the existence of things like chemosynthetic life, or life that is dependent not on photosynthesis and on the sun, but by the chemicals brought up by underwater processes. We're only beginning to understand what the importance of the deep sea is. We didn't know about climate change. We didn't know about biodiversity and the biodiversity crisis. None of that had happened. And so I think when we look at the Convention on the Law of the Sea, you have to bear that in mind. However, despite all of that, there is an important article, Article 145, which requires the Seabed Authority to adopt measures to ensure effective protection for the marine environment from harmful effects, and it goes on to say, of seabed mining. This is crucial because effective protection is a very high bar, as is to ensure. The advisory opinion given by the Tribunal for the Law of the Sea made it very clear that to ensure something is a very high bar. It means do your best to use due diligence obligations. And so Article 145, when twinned with the precautionary approach, which is, we all know, again, the precautionary approach from the Rio Declaration, and widely believed to be binding on all states, and is embraced, has to be said, by the negotiators in the Seabed Authority. Once you twin the precautionary approach with the lack of knowledge that we have, the necessity to ensure effective protection of the marine environment, these, we believe, the Deep Sea Conservation Coalition lay the groundwork for the absolute critical need for a moratorium. One thing I do want to drill into a little bit more is this 2-year rule, which was introduced by the 1994 implementing agreement. And that 2-year rule says that, sorry, I do need to explain a little bit about how this works, and that's that under the Law of the Sea Convention, a state sponsors a contractor. So a company which wants to engage in seabed mining has to be sponsored by a state. And then that contract has to be given a plan of work, or a contract to be able to engage in exploitation. No contracts of work have been granted yet, but these, they are in the pipeline. What this 2-year rule was, which was introduced in 1994, said, if a state makes a request, the council shall complete the adoption of rules, regulations, and procedures within 2 years of the request. Well, Nauru, a tiny country of 10,000 people in the Pacific, on behalf of its seabed mining contractor called Nori, which is in turn a subsidiary of the metals company, used to be called Deep Green, made this request. And so what they want to happen now is they're saying, well, the council has to adopt or complete the adoption of rules, regulations, and procedures by July 2023, which is only a year from now. It goes on to say that if the council hasn't done this, it hasn't adopted the rules, regulations, and procedures, it shall nevertheless consider and provisionally approve such plan of work. In other words, even if there are no rules in place, this 2-year rule says, well, you still got to give a plan of work. Well, precisely, it says you must consider and provisionally approve a plan of work. This 2-year rule contains a lot of legal ambiguity, a lot of legal questions, not of all of which we can get into in this webinar. But suffice it to say that, firstly, it is clear that what it does not mean is that there's some sort of legal obligation to adopt regulations by July 2023. Simply, apart from anything else, the rule says, well, if you haven't adopted the rules, regulations, procedures, you've got to do something else. So clearly, even on the face of the Part 15, the 2-year rule, it envisages that the council may not adopt rules, regulations, and procedures. And secondly, it doesn't say that a seabed mining application has to be granted. What it says is that the council has to consider and provisionally approve the plan of work. Well, they clearly would have to do so against the background of what I just showed you, the Article 145 of the Law of the Sea Convention, as well as Article 192, which requires that the ocean be protected, and so on. So there's a lot of other provisions that come into play here. And so there's a great deal of uncertainty, and the Seabed Authority is due to consider what some of this may mean next October. What are some of the problems with the Seabed Authority? Well, and this is what I would call the third leg of our call for a moratorium. The first leg being the damage caused to the marine environment. The second leg being the enormous amounts of unknowns, both about the ocean itself and about the science, about the technology that would be used. But the third leg, which is really important, is that the Seabed Authority is simply not fit for purpose. It was negotiated, as I said, in the 1970s. It doesn't even include a scientific committee, which is extraordinary. No one these days who negotiated a new international agreement would consider doing so without a scientific committee being included. There is the Legal Technical Commission instead, and the Legal Technical Commission meets behind closed doors. It's comprised of 30 members elected by states. And I'll talk a little bit later about the Legal Technical Commission, but it has specifically been asked to hold open meetings and it's refused. And the Deep Sea Conservation Coalition has asked for many, many years for a scientific committee to be put into place. That hasn't happened. And there's another absolutely crucial problem with the structure of the Seabed Authority, and that's that in order, and this is again something put into place in 1994 in the agreement I talked about, if a plan of work is considered by the Legal Technical Commission and they make a recommendation to adopt it, in other words, to award the license, if you like, that can only be refused by the council by a 2/3 vote of council with a majority of all what are called the smaller number of different organizations comprised of different. It gets very complicated about how these work, but basically it's going to be virtually impossible, put it this way, to overturn a recommendation by the LTC, and that is a fundamental problem that we have. There's a conflict of interest by the ISA, but as both a regulator as well as potential beneficiary of hundreds of millions or billions of dollars. We have seen very clearly over the years a huge bureaucratic or institutional momentum to mine the deep sea, and we've talked about the 2-year trigger that NAURA has triggered. And one of the things I do want to talk about is the financial aspects of this. The financial mechanism has still not been decided, not by a long shot. The African group, for example, which takes a very active role in negotiation, has said both there should be a profit sharing component to the regulation, financial regulations, but also they have said, well, the royalty should be in the region of 40%, whereas currently the European countries have asked for 2%, 4%, 6%, that kind of range. And contractors have demanded a 17% return on capital because they say it's so risky. We do know some of the royalty arrangements that are being paid by or promised to be paid by the contractors, and they're very, very small. $1.25 a ton, possibly increased to maybe double that. When these nodules are estimated to be worth, who knows, about $800 a ton. So it's a tiny fraction of the sponsoring states. We know that NAURA has agreed not to charge corporate taxes. We hear a lot from the Seabed Authority, oh, well, there'll be billions of dollars made in corporate taxes. Well, actually, behind the scenes, we now know, due to the Securities and Exchange filings, that NAURA has agreed contractually not to charge any corporate taxes at all, only to charge the royalties. We know that Papua New Guinea lost $120 million in a failed venture with Nautilus, which includes some of the parties included now in the metals company. We know that Mexico decided for environmental reasons not to grant a seabed mining consent to a company called Odyssey for phosphate mining. Odyssey is now suing Mexico for $3.5 billion for not granting the consent. So this is one reason that we say that states should be very, very, very careful about sponsoring deep sea mining applications and even for exploration, because once you allow companies to engage in exploration, spending tens of millions a country later on, and also then quickly gets very complex, but basically they can well be held liable for damages if they either do not obey some or implement what are called direct obligations, or if they don't exercise proper due diligence. And lastly, I do want to say that the royalties from the so-called common heritage of mankind are very unlikely to be significant. Estimates so far in the negotiations are that maybe something like $100,000 per year. cents per man, woman and child would be payable under the Common Heritage of Mankind ultimately. The vast majority of money would go to the contractors and to the sponsoring states under the regulations as are being developed. Excuse me. And finally, where are we heading now? The Seabed Authority is continuing to develop exploitation regulations. There's a 2-week negotiation session coming up in mid-July. And again, ostensibly against this background of meeting this July deadline. And again, we said really clearly, if regulations are adopted, this means green light has been given to mining. We hear a lot about countries saying, including my country, New Zealand, saying, oh, well, we want to negotiate the best environmental regulations possible. Unfortunately, no matter what those regulations say, I've laid out the structural problems with the Legal and Technical Commission. There is no appeal except by contractors, and this is extraordinary. Under the law of the Sea Convention, as amended by this 1994 agreement, contractors, if refused a plan of work, can go to the Tribunal for the Law of the Sea and make a complaint there. On the other side, those who are concerned to protect the ocean, not only can they not appeal the grant of a contract or plan of work, they can't even be heard, that they have no standing to go to the Tribunal for the Law of the Sea. So the deck is completely stacked against the ocean's health and protection. The metals companies say they will be doing a full component test. That's a test of their mining operation in the 3rd or 4th quarter of this year, and say they intend to apply for a plan of work in late 2023. And I've cited the G7 comment. So this is why the Deep Sea Conservation Coalition is calling for a moratorium unless and until environmental, social, and economic risks are comprehensively understood, that mining can be managed to ensure the effective protection of the marine environment with no loss of biodiversity, that there is the free, prior informed consent of Indigenous peoples and communities, that all alternatives have been fully explored and applied, that there is broad and informed public support secured, and that mining fulfills the obligation to benefit humankind as a whole, and that there is comprehensive reform of the Seabed Authority so there is a transparent, accountable, inclusive, and environmentally responsible decision-making and regulatory process. Now, that call for a moratorium was embraced by the world in IUCN Resolution 122, which called on state members to support and implement such a moratorium, by 30 states in favour with 6 opposed and 12 abstaining. So there is already a mandate out there for a moratorium under the International Union for the Conservation of Nature's Resolution 122. I talked a little about the problems with the Seabed Authority and public participation. While observers are able to participate in the Council and the Assembly in the discussions by making statements or interventions, again, the all-powerful Legal and Technical Commission meets behind closed doors, and even though there is a specific requirement or formally a request by the Assembly to hold more open meetings, they've ignored that, and they even now, going to 5 years later, they said, no, we are going to continue to meet behind closed doors. Workshops are tightly controlled by the Seabed Authority. Participation and speakers are tightly controlled. The Secretariat is openly hostile. For example, the Michael Lodge last year just saying that international negotiations are increasingly confronted with what they call, he says, extreme ideological positions, including a growing environmental extremism and dogmatism bordering on fanaticism in some instances. This is the Secretary General speaking. And what he's referring to is the growing body of alarm and concern expressed by civil society and governments and other parts of the international community. It is not just extreme ideological positions, but this is what we're faced with in the Seabed Authority. It's been a very strong voice for ocean protection over the years. They have strongly participated in both the financial regulation, the enterprise, which is an idea whereby the Seabed Authority itself can engage in seabed mining activities. They believe that this would go some way towards levelling the playing field. They're pressing for equitable financial terms. They pressed, for example, for a discussion of liability that was ignored by the Council. And I've listed here, for example, some of the countries that frequently attend the International Seabed Authority. So thank you for your attention. I'm sorry that it was rather long, but it is a complex issue, and I really look forward to Phil's contribution and to have a conversation later. So thank you all.
Thank you very much, Mr. Duncan. Quick questions before Phil jumps in. Regarding the ISA and the conflict of interest issues when it comes to being a regulator and a beneficiary, what do you suggest should be the way forward for the ISA? Do we get another organization that should probably be responsible for issuing licensing?
A very good question, Gideon. It certainly needs to be addressed. There's no doubt about that. You know, the seeds of the structure put into place by the Law of the Sea Convention contains this inherent conflict of interest. And yeah, we suggest that a moratorium is best brought about by what's called another implementing agreement, similar to the 1994 agreement, and issues such as this conflict of interest could be addressed by the in that negotiation. And you're right, you would ultimately need, if seabed mines to continue or to be carried out, you would need to separate, I think, the regulator and the body that receives the royalties.
Second question, when it comes to moratorium, how long do you think a moratorium should be in place? 10 years, 20 years?
That's a very good question, Gideon. Peter Thompson, the Oceans ambassador, said a couple of years ago in Davos before the COVID crisis that he suggested using the 10-year decade of ocean science to gather more information and then make a decision at the end of the 10 years. 10 years isn't very long. I have seen there's a very good scientific paper that's been published that lays out a plan of work for the next 10 years, which needs to be carried out if we're to gather the information that we need. But that's not enough. As I said, we also need the other legs of the moratorium to be clear that we're not going to be causing more damage to the ocean, to be clear that we have enough information, and most importantly, that the international regulatory regime is fit for purpose.
Prince, I would allow you to ask a question, then we quickly move on to Phil. You have to unmute.
Hello?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. So I want to ask about the ISA issuing more than 29 exploration leases so far. And we are hearing that half of that has gone to UK, China, France, Belgium, Germany, and Russia, these countries.
Yeah, and India.
And India. What kind of decisions were taken before these leases were given to these countries to mine deep ocean?
Thank you, Prince. That's a very good question, because these applications are considered behind closed doors by the Legal and Technical Commission. So we don't know a lot of the technical matters that were discussed, the financial matters that were discussed. We don't know about the issues that arose. All that we do know is the report that was sent to Council and then the discussion made by Council. Secondly, we know that no application for a plan of work has been refused to date, although I would say that the small Pacific Island country of Tuvalu did lodge an application, and then after a few weeks actually rescinded or withdrew its support for that application, and that's really very significant. They've rethought their involvement. There are a lot of problems. we know there are compliance issues with the exploration contract, yet not a single, as far as we know, contract has been penalised for non-compliance, and even the names of the parties that are in non-compliance are not told to the council. So there's a lot of transparency issues. And you're absolutely right. And the way that licenses have been issued, both requested and issued, has really subverted, distorted the way that the Seabed Authority was set up, because one of the important parts of the arrangement is that areas are what are called reserved for developing countries. Yet in the Pacific, those reserved areas are controlled now by this one company, the Metals Company, which controls reserved areas for applied for by Kiribati, by Tuvalu, and by Nauru. So effectively, you've got this company, which is a Western company listed on the NASDAQ Stock Exchange in New York, in control over areas that were intended for the developing world. There are a lot of other problems like that. I mean, for example, UK Seabed Resources, we know is owned by the Lockheed Martin, for example, yet they're applying under the UK flag. We know that there's a really crucial issue of what's called effective control, that the Law of the Sea Convention requires that the sponsoring state controls the contractor effectively, and that's really important, because otherwise the contractor can say, oh, sorry, I've caused some damage to the marine environment, I'm not making money, I'm going to leave now, leaving the sponsoring state or the environmental community, the environment, to bear the loss. Yet right now, all the Seabed Authority says, as long as you've incorporated a company within the jurisdiction, that's enough. That cannot possibly be sufficient for effective control of these contractors. So there's a lot of very large gaps. And yeah, Phil, I see he's put in his chat just to say that, sorry, maybe I misspoke, that the countries that are controlled by the Metals Company are Kiribati, Tonga, and Nauru. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Duncan. There are a lot of questions. We will come back after Phil is done, so they both address most of the questions. Phil will be looking at, he's been doing a lot of campaign work within the Pacific region, and he will share with us some of his successes and strategies within the region, and how we in Africa could also deploy some of his tools in our campaign against deep seabed mining. Phil, over to you.
Kia ora tātou. Thank you, Gideon and Prince, for inviting us on today. It's a real pleasure and honor to be here talking to you all. Yeah, I guess I'll sort of talk personally about what the campaign has looked like in Aotearoa, New Zealand over the last 17 years, and then open out to the Pacific and then the global sort of wave of momentum that's building. I think, as Duncan pointed out, there's effectively, in the international context, there's effectively three pillars to the call for a moratorium, and as he said, they are lack of scientific knowledge of the receiving environment, the baseline knowledge of the deep ocean, therefore our inability to understand, we don't even know what exists there, or how the ecosystems interplay, or what the functions of the deep sea are, let alone the wide-ranging impacts. And then, of course, the unavoidable, inescapable environmental damage that we do know would occur if this activity was enabled, and then the need for institutional reform of the governing body, the International Seabed Authority. But going back to the story here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, our government opened up our waters for seabed mining in 2005, and they quickly started issuing prospecting exploration licenses, and within a matter of weeks it took for the opposition to start standing up. and it started with tangata whenua, the people, the indigenous people of in the town that I live in. Actually, there was a plan to mine directly off our shore, and the indigenous leaders came to the wider community and raised concern and informed us that this was coming our way. And the initial response, and I've seen this basically in every conversation when it's the first time you sort of explain what's being planned or what's being proposed, because we must remember this is a proposed activity. It's not happening anywhere in the world on the scale of what's being proposed. And the first response is very consistent that I've experienced, and that is people shake their heads and try to understand what the heck I'm talking about, and how outrageous an idea this is. Especially, you know, I'm a coastal person. The ocean is across the road. I play in the ocean every other day, and we are ocean people who are connected, and you know, we have a great reverence for and respect for and love of the marine environment, and the idea of an activity that just so blatantly wreaks havoc and causes damage to that environment is just a boldly offensive suggestion. And so that's been in my experience of engaging with people face to face in small numbers and large numbers, is one of objection, and that's been expressed you know, across Aotearoa, New Zealand, across the Pacific, and now globally. The momentum is building. So we fast forward, I got really involved in 2012, and between 2014 and 2015 we had two very developed proposals to mine off the coast of Aotearoa, New Zealand, and they both went through applications through our Environmental Protection Authority. And the first two applications were staunchly opposed by a real, and this is clearly, this is interesting and important, because it was a diverse range of opposition. There were indigenous groups, community groups, environmental groups, recreational fishing groups, commercial fishing groups, you know, the fishing industry, the people who are currently dependent on a healthy ocean ecosystem to provide livelihoods, you know, food security, all of that. You clearly see the problems with this, and they've stood up across, you know, across all the different campaigns. So there was strong opposition, and both of those applications through our EPA were declined outright by the decision makers, and that was after, you know, lots of scientific scrutiny being put to the proposals. The first applicant came back in 2016 and reapplied with exactly, you know, pretty much the same application with no new information. Unfortunately, the EPA, through a poorly structured, or I'll put it nicely, a poorly structured decision-making process, gave consent, but then it was appealed through our courts at the High Court, Court of Appeals, and so and they've all been declined because the activity is inappropriate and unacceptable. We have repeatedly called for New Zealand to put in place moratoriums, and just this week on World Oceans Day, we submitted a petition with 36,000 signatures to the Parliament, and that is calling for an outright ban of the activity in our waters. And so that's where the campaign is in my country. In the Pacific, and I'll just elaborate, say one other thing about New Zealand. Our experience stands alone globally as far as scrutinizing this proposed activity. No other country has looked at it as closely. Mexico, as Duncan said, did process one application. It was also declined. So there's no application anywhere in the world has been scrutinized properly and then given consent. So I think New Zealand's experience is a forerunner to what is playing out globally right now. And I can really only see that as long as we all stand up and express our concerns strongly, loudly, resolutely, and consistently, and sustain our calls for a halt to this activity, I cannot see it getting the go-ahead, but it will take us standing up. Across the Pacific, the opposition is, very much similar to what we experienced here. The community groups, local community groups, and also regional groups that represent, large portions of the population across the region are coming together and making, strong calls. And the calls from the region are directly calling for a ban. There's a group called the Pacific Blue Line, which is made up of significant regional civil society, religious groups, and activists, and they are calling for a ban and doing excellent work across the region. And we are working closely with groups in Papua New Guinea, Cook Islands, Tonga, and elsewhere, who are doing great work in their countries as well. If we move out, and I think, I think the Pacific is an important, and listening to the concerns of the Pacific people is a very important thing, because this activity, the first area that's being proposed to mine is in the Pacific, and the impacts will be first felt there, and it's important we listen. There's also in the Pacific is a grouping of parliamentarians, the Pacific Parliamentarians Alliance on Deep Sea Mining, and they are calling for a moratorium at the ISA as well, and that's a growing movement of elected representatives from, I think, 10 jurisdictions across the region, and making very strong calls. We've got calls coming also from calling for a pause from former heads of state through a group called the Pacific Elders Voice. It's a grouping of respected, accomplished elders that are calling for a pause and wise decision making on this activity, and they also state clearly that there's a severe lack of capacity within the countries that are considering this activity to manage it properly, and great risks. Moving out to the global campaign, or the momentum for calls across the globe for a moratorium. Duncan expressed quite a few things there. There's the IUCN resolution 122 was a profound. I'm not particularly familiar myself with IUCN processes, but it's the largest conservation organization in the world with something like 1,400 members. In the lead up to the vote on the resolution, it was extraordinary, as far as I understand, in that there were no suggestions for changes to the text. It was allowed to push forward all the way to the decision-making point, and there was an extraordinarily high level of support across that, both from civil society organizations and from the government organizations that voted in favor. There were government organizations from 37 different countries that voted in favor of a moratorium. Where else can I go with this? I think what's really where it's moving to, with the pressure of the 2-year rule being triggered by Nauru, at the behest, I must say, at the behest of the company, the metals company, which is very much a wolf in sheep's clothing, the company, and make no mistake, they say lots of pretty words, but there's one intent behind it, and I don't need to tell you what that is. So where was I?
Yeah, the 2-year trigger by Nauru.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, under the 2-year trigger, there's been, strategically, I think it was a foolish move for the proponents of this activity to trigger that 2-year rule, because they poked the bear. The world has woken up to this activity, and the world is now engaging in the process of whether or not this activity should get the go ahead. Sorry, and our observation is that most humans, most organizations, and it's looking like most countries don't think it should get the go-ahead, at least in the short term. And there are discussions developing around the call for, a slowdown at the very least, a moratorium at the highest level. And so there's developing discussions there, and we hope that these discussions come out into the open very soon. So the comments from the G7, from the Pacific, the European Parliament, and the governments of New Zealand and many other governments recognizing that this activity will cause, has serious impacts on the environment. That's not going unnoticed, and I think they're laying the pathway for stopping this, I think, and I think we need to back them up, and we need, we're engaging directly with our decision makers here and in New Zealand, and they are asking for pressure from us. They in their hearts, they see the problems, and they need pressure from society to give them the mandate to act. So there's lots more. I think from when we, I don't know what stage any efforts from you guys are at in Africa in your efforts of advocacy for the ocean and on this issue, but it starts with awareness raising, which I think is what you're doing right now, and all of the campaigns start with raising awareness with the people, raising awareness across different levels and sectors of society, all the way up to the top, where the decision makers need to understand. And so thank you for calling us here to talk to you, and this is the first step.
Thank you very much, Phil. I mean, regarding your question as to where we are at in terms of advocacy, we are still in the very infant stages. The challenge now is that the African group is not presenting a very united front. Although they are calling for a moratorium, there are still some countries who want the exploitation to go ahead. But I have two questions for you. Regarding the New Zealand specific instance where the courts overturned the decision by the EPA, was it an instance of a coalition of organizations challenging the EPA in courts, or it was an individual who decided to go to court?
I mean, we have and it's very different from what's being proposed for decision making, or how decision making is being made at the International Seabed Authority. We have a good opportunity to engage as members of the public. If an application goes forward, we can make a written submission, and then we can appear in the hearing and speak to, provide more information at the hearing. And we had hearings up to 40 days of sitting in front of decision makers, expressing our views and bringing in scientific experts and so on. And in the first application, there was a record number, 3 times the number of any other EPA application in opposition. There was 4,500 written submissions. In the third EPA application, that number swelled to 13,500. So the strong opposition. I think you could say a coalition of 13,500, Gideon. So we all engaged in the process, and it was significantly, it was environmental organizations, it was the fishing industry, it was indigenous groups closest to the mining site that opposed strongly and have sustained that opposition all the way through the courts.
I mean, I am happy that in the instance of New Zealand, it's a ban. It's a complete ban on deep seabed mining. Where do you think our advocacy should be directed towards? Because I am appalled by overfishing. I am appalled by ocean pollution. And I think that deep seabed mining is also going to add another layer of destruction to the ocean ecosystem. I am for moratorium, but I am more leaning towards a complete ban. Where do you fall?
Personally, I know enough. I've looked at this enough to have the personal view that this activity cannot be done without causing serious harm. So it just should not be an option. It's a proposed activity, and when they were proposing it, as Duncan pointed out, under when the international community was proposing this, it was the 70s and 80s and 90s, before we had these converging crises of climate crisis and biodiversity crises and so on. And so it's completely an inappropriate activity given the dire state of our environment in general. If you look at the ocean, every measurable indicator of ocean health is in decline. And we are talking about adding another pressure, another stressor. It's crazy. And so, but I think the politically I think, we first put a petition into Parliament in 2016, and that was calling for a moratorium in New Zealand. And we've moved that now 5 years later to ban. And so, yeah, I mean, and there's a cross section of positions amongst groups that are opposing this activity globally. As I said, many in the Pacific are calling for a ban. Greenpeace they are a coalition member of the Deep Sea Conservation Coalition. They are one of our members, but their independent position is much closer to a ban position than a moratorium. They are aligning themselves more so with civil society calls, which across the Pacific the general feel is ban. In some jurisdictions, like the Cook Islands government is so keen on enabling this activity that to call for a ban at this point is politically untenable. So they're calling for a moratorium. So it's horses for courses, as we say here. You choose the appropriate position given the context you're working in.
Yeah, Prince.
Yeah. Okay. My first question has to do with a lot of campaigns. I know that we civil society organizations and campaign coalitions like ourselves have called for energy transition for a long time, moving away from fossil fuel to clean energy. And what we are understanding now is that these clean energy companies like electric companies producing electric cars are saying that mining cobalt, for instance, is important for the manufacturing of these electric car batteries and other information infrastructure batteries and all that. How do we draw the balance? Gideon asked about how to direct the campaign, but how do we draw the balance? We are calling for energy transition, running away from fossil fuel to clean energy. Now, the clean energy is also putting another environmental pressure on our ocean. What do we do now?
Yeah, it's a good question, absolutely, and there's that's one that comes up all the time, because the company that they were masters at spin, and they got their message. They had free rein in the media globally for a long time about the need, what they pitched as the need to go to the deep sea for these minerals. It's simply not true. The statistics show that we have minerals on land enough to meet demand, projected demand. and to open up as Duncan said, to open up a new area of exploitation and environmental destruction is not the way forward, and it won't replace land-based mining. It will add the environmental impact, except a different group of miners will get very wealthy, you know, and that's the objective from their point of view. I think also is a key thing here is what Duncan touched on also is the fast developing technologies around battery technology. Cobalt is effectively being phased out by, you know, some of the largest EV companies in the world. And, you know, BYD, I think it is in China, is the second largest electric vehicle manufacturer, and they've moved to cobalt-free technology. So, yeah, it's a moving space, and we need to, you know, we need to learn more. We do need to push for, you know, recycling and circular economy initiatives. We can fix the demand issue, I think, with words on paper through policy that implores manufacturers, you know, recycling and circular economy initiatives, or, you know, mandates it. So
we have a few minutes gone past our time here, but I mean, if we could squeeze in a few more questions, if that is okay with you, Duncan and Phil. Two
Sure.
questions before we come to Prince, and then we move to the participants joining us. First of all, it's a legal question. Internationally, conservation groups, what are the legal tools available to help reform the ISA? And also to Phil, there are companies who have now joined the call for moratorium and also a complete ban on deep seabed mining. How do we, campaigners back in Africa, how do we get some of the large companies here to sign up to some of these policies which benefit the ocean?
I'll take the first half of that, and maybe Phil can come in with the second half. Firstly, I would say, quite honestly, the best way really to campaign and participate in the international processes, I think, is going to be in the UN General Assembly. That's where there's real recognition of public participation, transparency. That's where, you know, African people, youth groups, women, others can get involved. There's something called Notions Omnibus Resolution that's passed every year. That's negotiated in September and November. And that will be, I think, an important first place to engage delegates. But before that, I would advocate, and this ties into a question we had on the chat, as to what are the relevant agencies to involve in advocacy. You know, the first one that we see is it's always the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or External Affairs. So, you know, talk to your foreign minister, meet with them, insist on consultations before they attend the International Seabed Authority meetings as a first step. Express your concern, meet with other government officials. Like Phil and I were in Wellington just 2 days ago, meeting with the Department of Conservation officials as well as Ministry of Foreign Affairs officials, because conservation in New Zealand is the lead agency responsible for conservation issues, and they've taken an interest in seabed mining. The interest in New Zealand, our country, the Ministry for the Environment is another one. So yeah, speak up, you know, insist on your voice being heard, and yeah, really ask that your government opens a debate in the UN General Assembly, saying this is a matter of global importance. It shouldn't be just determined by the would-be seabed miners. Yeah, Phil's made a good point that engage the ministries responsible for fishing, fisheries ministers as well, because most fishing industries, when they hear about this, they realize this potentially is really, really bad for fishing industry. And what, just going back a little bit to your question about ban versus moratorium, and I endorse Phil's response. Internationally, I would say a moratorium is the recognized approach to many of these problems. Drift net fishing was one example. There was approached by a moratorium, but now it's effectively a ban, but broken in some places. The best example, I think, the best template, if you like, is in the 1990s, there was going to be a convention for the regulation of Antarctic minerals, for mining in Antarctica. It was called CRAMRA. Yet, as soon as it was concluded, a lot of groups, including Greenpeace and others, said this is a really bad idea to mine, engage in mining in Antarctica. And they had a very active campaign. And before too much time had passed, both, in this case, France and Australia spoke up and said, yeah, we agree. And then, so instead of ratifying the minerals regime, they negotiated a whole new set of agreements, put into place a 50-year ban on seabed mining, and with very strict requirements on what would need to be in place if that ban was to be lifted, as well as a series of precautionary measures such as environmental impact assessments and in particular areas put into place. So it's not, the saying is every journey seems impossible until you head off, until you start, and then at the end of it seems inevitable. And I think that's where we are, is that while it may seem impossible to get there, actually, if you look at the Antarctic minerals experience, I'd argue it's inevitable, and also seeing the groundswell of public opinion. Thank you.
I agree with the inevitability thing. I just, it's such a bad idea that I don't think it will happen, but it will take that sustained opposition and diverse opposition. I also just I can't remember the question, but the other thing I wanted to say here was in the awareness raising sort of efforts that you do, targeting groups, influential groups that are not necessarily part of government, but represent, like say the artisanal fishing collective. I think I read some time ago, there's a significant artisanal fishing group in Africa, and other groups that can do the, if they become well informed and become partners of yours, then they can do the advocacy also. And then you've got, a range of groups approaching decision makers. What was the question that you wanted? So the
question, I think in part you have answered the question. It had to do with bringing on board big and influential companies to also support the call for a moratorium.
Yeah. I just say every single conversation, every single opportunity that you have to talk about this, talk about it. Just go through your list of influential companies, organizations, coalitions of groups, whatever. Just sit down with them, explain the situation. We at the DSCC, SOA, Sustainable Ocean Alliance, is a new member of the DSCC. We are at your service. We have expertise. Duncan is our legal advisor. We have communications advisors. We can backfill your knowledge. There's a lot of, so that you can have in-depth, meaningful discussions with people you want to engage with and bring on board. We can support that effort. So yeah, I think you just knock on doors and you walk through the ones that open, and you slowly push the ones that are closed over time. Yeah.
Fantastic. Prince, final question to you.
My final question, during Duncan's presentation, he mentioned that there are new battery technologies that might not really need the deep sea minerals to use. And then Phil also mentioned that there are companies in China that produce electric cars that are using different technologies that are cobalt free. But of course, some of the minerals that are, we are told are being mined from the seabed are, sulfuride and phosphorus, some, meant for fertilizer and all that. those ones are in agri sector, and it is not about electric vehicle production and all that. And so there's still the challenge therein. I want to find out, where is the pressure coming from? What is the motive? Where is the pressure coming from for the countries to accept for the deep sea mining?
Duncan, yep. You're on mute, sorry.
Thank you. Let me take the first cut of that, and then you can pass to you, Phil, because where the pressure is coming from, Prince, I'd say what is really interesting is that in the seabed mining sphere, you don't have the traditional mining companies being involved at all. They're all new companies. They're all special seabed mining companies. And that says something. I think it says, as Phil said, is different people that seek to become rich. But I think also it's the existing mining companies, seems to me, are standing back and saying, I'm not sure if this is going to work. And that, I think we need to listen to that firstly. Secondly, I think where the pressure is really coming from is for people who want to seabed mine, it's the industry. The metals company has mounted a really aggressive public relations campaign for the past few years. It's them that have, I have to say successfully, got onto the agenda the idea that we need deep sea minerals for the renewables revolution. And that's just not true. You know what's interesting though? Their current public relations push, and we've seen some public filings on this and so on, is they're now saying to the United States, hey, you need these deep sea minerals for security reasons. So they're now appealing to more nationalistic reasons, and they're appealing to border reasons. And for example, as Phil said, cobalt, yes, is being phased out of many electric vehicle batteries configurations, but cobalt also has a lot of uses in things like jet engines, rocket engines, military applications, and so on. Nickel, again, some batteries don't use nickels, a lot of them do, but I think something like 60% of nickel is used in stainless steel applications. So it's a real trap, if you like, to say, oh, all these minerals are going to be mined in the deep sea are necessary, and they're going to be used for good reason for climate change. That's simply a narrative which the company has adopted. There's also a lot of commentary out there with respect to different minerals. So actually, there's not a supply pressure on some of these minerals. The prices have dropped over the last few years considerably. I mean, that's why I said early on, we don't know what metals needs we're going to need in 2 years' time, 5 years' time, 10 years' time, 20 years' time. The further we go out it goes, you just simply don't know. What we do know is that, and this is not restricted to deep sea mining, we can no longer have this extractivist mentality when we say, I want to do this activity, I'm going to engage this new industrial mine activity to provide the metals for this activity. Instead, we have to look at, how do we regulate our lives? How do we address climate change? How do we address biodiversity in a holistic way? And for example, it's not even the answer to say, even if we were to want 1 billion EV cars by 2048, most analysts are saying, actually, no, we need public transportation. We need different forms of transportation. We're not all going to be driving around in battery-powered EV cars in 30 years from now. So, we have to be aware, and that's why I showed the slide on planetary boundaries, is that this is a much bigger issue than just deep sea mining. It's how do we approach our lives and our economies and adjust it to the, unfortunately, for our children and children's children, the very severe reality that we are bequeathing on our children, a world which is got major, is going to suffer from climate change, extinctions, and biodiversity crisis. How do we address that? So, to me, it really is a very large question of the issue of the question you asked. I'll pass on to Phil.
Yeah, I would just agree with everything Duncan just said. Then I think also we need that pressure. A response is if you're looking to the deep sea for to meet those pressures, you also have to look at your obligations and responsibilities to protect the environment, because the the activity of strip mining, vast areas of deep ocean ecosystems with permanent damage is not legal. We've agreed not to do that sort of thing already. So to push ahead with it is inappropriate, and we shouldn't be doing it. And then it does absolutely, this whole issue opens out into the bigger discussion around societal behavior change going forward, and you know, wise decisions. You know, we may need to reduce some of our affluence, particularly in the developed world. You know, but thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Duncan. Thank you very much, Mr. Phil, for making time for us this morning. I know it's very early at your end. Thank you very much. Thank you to the SOA Africa community members from Lagos, Cameroon, and also Ghana for joining us. And of course, thank you to Prince as well for making time for joining us. We will continue the conversation in Africa, and we will do our bits and our parts to support the call for moratorium on deep seabed mining. Until we meet again, have a lovely day, everybody. Bye-bye.
Nice to see you all. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.